Hello everyone, this is Homer White back again with the second part of the 5th chapter of our course on sampling. Last time we looked at the idea of sampling and covered several commendable random sampling methods such as simple random sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. This time we're going to be a bit more negative and consider some problems in sampling. We're going to look at the way that bias can creep into one's sampling methods, and in particular we're going to examine 3 types of bias: selection bias, non-response bias, and response bias. So let's talk about bias in sampling methods. Bias is a property of a sampling method. We say that a sampling method is biased if it exhibits a systematic tendency to result in samples that do not reflect the population in some important way, that is, in a way that's associated with the kinds of questions that you plan to ask the subjects in the sample. To organize the types of bias, it's helpful to think about the collection of data as breaking down into 3 steps. The first step is selecting the subjects to invite into your sample. The second step is to get these subjects to accept your invitation. This is particularly an issue if your subjects are people, but sometimes it's an issue if your subjects are other sorts of things like animals, plants, or other types of objects. Thirdly, after you've gotten them into your sample and they've agreed to participate, you have to actually obtain their responses to your questions. At each of these steps, bias can creep in, and so there's a particular type of bias for each step. The first type of bias is selection bias, and it's associated with step 1, problems with your scheme for selecting people to be in your sample in the first place. So we say that a sampling method exhibits selection bias if its mechanism for selecting the sample has a systematic tendency to overrepresent or underrepresent a particular subset of the population. For example, suppose that you conduct a survey to learn the opinions of U.S. adults on capital punishment, and you construct a poll on the Huffington Post, which is an online newspaper, asking visitors to the site to respond to several questions about the death penalty. You might want to take a moment before proceeding with the video, just put it on stop, and think about the kinds of problems that are likely to emerge in a sample that you construct in this way. I can think of a couple of sources of selection bias right away. First of all, the Huffington Post is known to be a little bit left-leaning politically, so visitors to that particular website would tend to be more liberal than is average for the population. So your sampling method will probably underrepresent conservatives, who tend to favor the death penalty more than liberals. So you see you have underrepresentation of a certain segment of the population, and the way in which they're unrepresented is important for the kinds of questions you were planning to ask. Secondly, the poll was conducted only online, since the Huffington Post is an online newspaper. So your method not only underrepresents, but completely excludes those who don't use the internet. Now, might this be important? It's hard to tell. It all depends on whether internet users and non-users of the internet differ in their opinions on capital punishment. They might differ a little, and then this kind of exclusion is not so important, but they might differ a lot, and then this exclusion could result in a very misleading sample. And the problem with biased sampling methods that have selection bias, is that you'll never really learn from your sample how big that bias is, how important these differences are. Convenience sampling is a type of sampling that's very subject to selection bias. Convenience sampling is the practice of selecting subjects who are easy to find or to include in the sample. So for example, suppose that you wanted to estimate the average height of Georgetown College students, and you happen to be taking a kinesiology class on basketball coaching, so you decide to measure the heights of the fellow students you have in that class. I guess you can see the source of bias right away. Probably folks who are interested in basketball coaching may have done some basketball before in their lives, and they may be a bit taller than average. So as a rule, keep in mind, non-random sampling methods are usually subject to selection bias at some level, and the amount of this bias is often difficult or impossible to determine because you can't tell from your sample how different this sample is from the population as a whole. And you know what? Taking a bigger sample is not going to help. If there's a systematic tendency to underrepresent some segment of the population, even if you take a large sample, you'll still systematically underrepresent that segment of the population. I suppose you could try to sample everyone. That would be about the only way to get rid of selection bias. Random sampling methods, I'd like to point out, can also be subject to selection bias, but because they are designed so as to use chance in a controlled and quantifiable way, it's always possible to correct for that bias. Now, simple random sampling has no bias to it at all. Stratified sampling will have some bias if you choose not to sample with your strata proportionate to the population, but then this bias can be corrected for. Now let's move to the second step of data collection. You've selected some subjects to be in your sample, and you'd like to get them to actually agree to take part in the study. This is where non-response bias can creep in. And every type of sampling method, including the wonderful random sampling methods we went over last time, can be subject to non-response bias. We say that a sampling method exhibits non-response bias if there's a systematic tendency for the people who elect to take part in the survey to differ from the population in some important way. That is, if those who choose to respond differ from those who do not choose to respond to your invitation to be in the sample, then those who choose to respond will differ from the general population as well. The general population includes those who would have responded and those who would have not, whereas the sample includes only those who did respond. This produces a systematic difference between the sample and the population, a difference that could be important for the kinds of questions that you plan to ask. For example, say you conduct a survey to learn the opinions of U.S. adults on capital punishment. You construct that poll on the online Huffington Post, asking visitors to respond to several questions about the death penalty. So it's the same example as before. But if you think about it, this type of poll is also subject to some non-response bias. After all, it takes some time or some effort to fill out a questionnaire, even an online questionnaire. So those visitors to the site who do go out of their way to fill out that questionnaire may have stronger opinions on the issue of capital punishment than those who do not choose to take part in this survey. So your sample may end up overrepresenting those who have strong opinions either for or against the death penalty. It'll leave out those whose opinions are more in the mushy middle. Here are some other examples. Quite often we send out survey forms through the mail and hope that people will fill them out and send them back to us. Mail surveys are especially subject to non-response bias. The non-response rate for mail surveys is often around 90% or even higher. If non-responders have a very different attitude than responders regarding the questions you plan to ask, then your poll is going to give some very misleading results. Even phone polls are subject to a certain amount of non-response bias. So when you get a phone call, it's a lot easier to just go ahead and answer the questions. But some folks will hang up rather than answer questions. And there are some folks who won't get the call because they've got call blocking. They may have other mechanized ways besides hanging up for refusing to respond to a phone poll. So the question arises, do people who refuse to respond to a phone poll differ in some way from those who do respond with regard to the questions that you tend to want to ask them? This is studied a great deal, especially with regards to surveys about political topics. And if you're interested, you could consult the web link at the bottom. Now let's move to the third step in collecting the data. Let's say you have chosen a sample. Let's say you have gotten people to agree to take part in the survey. Now you actually have to ask them the questions and get their responses. This is the third place in which bias can creep in. So we say that a sampling method exhibits response bias if the way the questions are asked or the way that they're framed tends to influence the subject's responses in a particular way that's important for the study. Now, there are many types of response bias, and I'll name a few here. One is deliberate response bias. So you've got deliberate response bias if the survey questions are deliberately worded in a biased manner so as to elicit a certain desired response from the subject. For example, suppose that you're doing a survey about a gun law before the City Council, and you ask your subjects, should the City Council prohibit carrying concealed weapons in public places, even though the Second Amendment expressly guarantees the right of every citizen to bear arms? You can clearly see that this question tends to pressure the subject to give an answer that opposes the new law. There's also bias from the desire of respondents to please the interviewer. People will respond differently depending on how they're asked a question, depending on whether they're asked face-to-face or over the telephone or on paper or on the internet. And depending on the question, different methods for asking it, face-to-face, over the telephone, or so on, may be more appropriate for eliciting the honest and true response from the subject. Quite often, a person might tend to be more honest when answering questions on paper or over the internet. So when speaking directly to the researcher, the respondent may be tempted to give the answer that he or she thinks the interviewer wants. For example, suppose you were conducting door-to-door interviews, identifying yourself as a college student and asking the subject if he or she supports increased public funding for higher education. The fact that you're known to the subject as a college student may cause the subject to be more likely to say that she favors increased public funding for higher education. She doesn't want to say something displeasing to you as someone who currently has to face the problem of paying for higher education. Sometimes there's bias from the question simply being too complex, so you want to keep your survey questions rather simple. Here's a real-life example. It comes from a survey on family planning that was conducted by the British Royal Commission on Population some years ago. I have a web link to an article in which it and a number of other biased questions were discussed. So here's the question. Again, it's asked of a woman. Has it happened to you that over a long period of time, when you neither practiced abstinence nor used birth control, you did not conceive? Now you have to ponder that question for a little bit in order to figure out exactly what's being asked. It's quite possible that a great many of the subjects simply gave an untrue answer because they couldn't understand the question. So we have no way of knowing whether the poll would have underestimated or overestimated the true proportion of women that did not conceive in a period of time when they were not taking steps to prevent conception. Another source of bias is from the order in which options for an answer to a single question are given. The order in which response options are presented can indeed affect the response. A common problem, for example, is in the polling booth on election day. You go into the booth and you look at the list of candidates. They come in a certain order from top to bottom. Studies have shown that the candidate whose name appears first tends to get a little advantage. Now, how much advantage that candidate gets depends on what election the candidate is in. Again, this topic is extensively studied, and you can look at a paper from the University of Virginia to learn more about it. One way that people might try to overcome order bias is to randomly order the options for an answer to different subjects. So for example, if you had two candidates, let's say candidate A and candidate B, it might be a good thing if half of the voters could see candidate A first and then candidate B, and the other half of the voters could see candidate B first and then candidate A. There's also an order bias that comes when you're asking multiple questions in the course of your survey. If one of the earlier questions requires respondents to think about something that they may not have otherwise considered when it comes time to answer the later question, then the order in which the questions are presented can indeed change the results. So for example, say you have a survey where you ask these two questions in this order. Do you own a smartphone? And then later on, how many hours a day do you spend on the internet? Now, if you think about it for a while, you can see that if someone is asked, do you own a smartphone first, before they are asked how many hours a day they spend on the internet, then their answer to the internet question may be higher than if they had not been asked if they own a smartphone. Think about that for a while, and you'll see how that could be true. Here's another example that's worth reading about. For a period of several years, some polls that were commissioned by Fox News showed that public support for the Affordable Care Act, the Health Reform Act, were much lower than most other polls. So, what was going on with Fox News? Why were their poll results showing much lower public support for the Affordable Care Act than all the other pollsters out there? Turned out that the reason was that at Fox News they were asking a whole series of questions on their surveys before they asked the questions about the Affordable Care Act. And the types of questions they asked tended to get subjects in a somewhat bad mood about the Obama administration, and thus cause subjects to give a lower rating to Obamacare than they would have given had they not been asked those questions prior. An analysis of this phenomenon is in Nate Silver's blog, Ch5P2, where he studies the Fox poll and shows how it was biased. Apparently it was an unintentional kind of bias, and it shows how difficult it can be to construct surveys that avoid response bias entirely. Thank you for listening.